In the wide, wind-bitten plains of South Dakota, where the horizon stretches longer than the conscience of the land itself, stories travel slower than storms but stay much longer. Towns are small, families are close, and the earth remembers what people try to forget. Among those stories, none has stayed as haunting as that of a boy named Elias Monroe, the child whose smile hid something older than innocence, something ancient and cruel. Elias was born in 1948 in a weather-stained farmhouse on the edge of Brook Hollow, a town so small it didn't even make the state map until the 1960s. His mother, a church pianist with trembling hands, raised him mostly alone. His father, a field hand with a fondness for whiskey and silence, left when Elias was 6. To most people, the boy seemed quiet, polite even. The sort of child who sat perfectly still in Sunday school while others fidgeted and whispered. But inside his stillness lived a pulse of something feral, a fascination that grew sharper each year. Animals began disappearing around the Monroe property. Chickens found with their throats neatly cut, stray cats hung from rafters in the barn. When neighbors asked, Elias said he'd found them that way. His mother believed him, she had to. In a world built on reputation and faith, admitting her son might be different felt worse than sin. By the time he turned 9, Elias had learned 2 lessons that would shape everything he became. That pain made people pay attention, and that lies, when spoken softly, sounded almost holy. Teachers described him as gifted but distant. Classmates called him strange. He was the kind of child who could remember Bible verses by heart, but laughed quietly when the preacher spoke of heaven. One teacher once caught him watching a wounded bird on the playground. The bird had broken its wing. Elias didn't try to help it. He simply watched until it stopped moving, then smiled. The teacher told no one. Brook Hollow was not the kind of place that believed in monsters, especially not young ones. Folks there believed evil wore a man's face, not a boy's. And so Elias kept moving through the years like a shadow in daylight. Unseen but always near, everything changed in the summer of 1960. A 7-year-old girl named Claire Wentworth vanished while walking home from church. For 3 days, the whole town searched, police, mothers with lanterns. Elias joined them, quiet as ever, carrying a small flashlight and asking questions about where she might have gone. On the 4th day, her body was found near an old grain barn, hidden under hay. The sheriff said it looked like she'd been arranged, like someone wanted her to be found a certain way. No one thought to ask Elias where he'd been that afternoon. The town mourned, the case faded, and life tried to move on. But Brook Hollow would never feel quite safe again. The parents stopped letting their children play past dusk. The church bells sounded lonelier. And in the Monroe house, Elias began spending more time in the barn, the place where the wind never seemed to blow. There were rumors later, of notebooks, sketches, of how he'd written about the feeling of owning silence. Some said he practiced voices in front of mirrors, perfecting his tone for when someone asked what happened. But at that time, all anyone saw was a boy with pale eyes who seemed too calm for his age. By 11, Elias had grown more confident. He began following people, watching them from the fields, memorizing when they were alone. He studied fear the way other children studied arithmetic. When the second disappearance came, the town could no longer call it coincidence. They didn't yet know they were living inside a nightmare written by a child. The story of Elias Monroe would travel far beyond South Dakota, not just because of what he did, but because of what he represented. He was the question no one wanted to ask: what happens when innocence itself turns predatory? In the years that followed, journalists would call him the boy with the glass eyes, doctors would call him a born psychopath, and the town would call him the devil's child. But before all those names, before the headlines and the courtroom sketches, he was just a boy walking through tall grass under a silent sky, a boy who smiled when the world looked away. The plains of South Dakota stretch wide enough to swallow a secret whole. In the early 1950s, the little farming town of Brook Hollow sat alone between 2 rivers and a long road that went nowhere in particular. The town had one church, one store, and more silence than conversation. People trusted each other there, or at least they thought they did. Life moved slow, until a boy named Elias Monroe was born, and the rhythm of the town began to bend in ways no one could explain. Elias came into the world during a thunderstorm that split the sky like judgment. His mother, Margaret Monroe, said he didn't cry when he was born. He just opened his pale eyes and stared at the doctor as though measuring him. The nurse remembered that stare for years. It felt, she said later, like he was looking through you, not at you. The Monroe family lived on the outskirts of town, in a sagging farmhouse surrounded by brittle fields and the remains of better years. Margaret played piano for the church. Her husband, Harold, worked the land and drank his earnings. Their marriage was built on silence and duty, not affection. When Harold finally left for the oil fields and never returned, neighbors felt pity for Margaret and her quiet little boy. They brought casseroles, whispered prayers, and offered help she never accepted. Margaret believed suffering was something to be endured, not shared. Elias grew up in that quiet, an empty kind of quiet that made him comfortable with stillness. He was polite, clean, obedient. He never argued, never shouted. Teachers liked that about him. They called him well-behaved, not realizing that obedience, for Elias, wasn't about respect, it was about control. He learned early that calmness unnerved people, and he used it the way other children used smiles. When he was 7, strange things began to happen around the Monroe property. Chickens were found dead, their necks twisted neatly. A neighbor's dog disappeared and later turned up buried behind Elias's barn. Margaret scolded him once for being cruel, but when he met her gaze and said, "I didn't do it," she believed him. She wanted to believe him. Mothers often mistake fear for faith. At school he was different, but not enough to alarm anyone. He sat alone at lunch, drew perfectly symmetrical faces in the margins of his notebook, and spent hours watching ants dismantle crumbs. Other boys teased him, but he never reacted. Instead, he watched them quietly, memorizing which one laughed first and which one looked away. The teacher once caught him holding a grasshopper over a candle flame behind the school. When asked why, he said, "I wanted to see if it screams." The teacher wrote it off as curiosity. South Dakota was full of boys who hunted, fished, and killed animals. No one saw what made Elias different. He didn't kill for food or sport. He killed for knowledge. He wanted to know how long life took to end. That question stayed with him like a hunger. By 9, he'd begun to keep notebooks. He wrote in tiny, precise letters lists of animals, dates, observations. One page read, "The smaller they are, the longer they move." When his mother found the notebook, she tore it up and burned it in the stove. Elias didn't protest. He simply started another one. The people of Brook Hollow started noticing him more. Mrs. Keller, who ran the store, said the boy gave her chills. He would stand near the counter, staring at the jar of pennies by the register, and whisper numbers under his breath. The pastor's wife said he had old eyes. The sheriff thought he was just odd. In towns like that, oddness was tolerated so long as it stayed quiet. Everything might have ended there if not for what happened in the summer of 1960. The air that year felt heavy, charged with drought and worry. Families were poor, tempers short. Children played barefoot until the fireflies came out and then ran home when the church bell rang 8. On one of those evenings, 7-year-old Claire Wentworth never made it home. Her parents searched the woods, the creek, every barn and shed. Elias joined the search party with a lantern. He asked questions. He suggested places to look. No one thought twice about it. They found Claire 3 days later near an abandoned grain barn, half hidden under hay. The sheriff said whoever did it must have been older, stronger. Brook Hollow grieved and prayed, and in their grief they stopped looking for a culprit. Evil, they told themselves, was something that came from outside, not something raised in their own fields. For Elias, the town's sorrow was a lesson. He watched how people wept, how they whispered, how fear turned them gentle. He understood that tragedy gave him power, the power to make the world stop and listen. From then on, he wanted that stillness again. The barn became his sanctuary. When the wind moved through its slats, it sounded like breathing. He spent hours there alone, arranging tools, writing in his new notebook, imagining new ways to test the boundaries of life and death. Margaret thought he was just hiding from loneliness. Sometimes she'd bring him food, and he'd thank her softly, never looking up. She didn't notice the stains on his hands or the smell that lingered. Whispers began spreading again when another child vanished a year later. No one accused Elias out loud, but doors started locking earlier, and mothers called their children home before dusk. The preacher said the devil had found work in their town. In a way, he was right. Elias Monroe would later be described by psychologists as perfect study in the absence of empathy. But long before the doctors, the courts, and the newspapers, he was just a boy sitting in a field of tall grass, staring at the horizon, wondering what it felt like to decide who deserved to keep breathing. Brook Hollow never recovered from what followed. Every generation told the story a little differently, yet one truth remained the same. Evil doesn't always come as a man. Sometimes it comes as a child who never learned to cry. The first true sign that something was wrong with Elias Monroe came one quiet Sunday morning in Brook Hollow, South Dakota. It was the kind of morning that made the whole town smell of dew and dust, when farmers polished their shoes, children fidgeted in stiff collars, and the church bell echoed like a heartbeat through the valley. Everyone gathered at the white clapboard chapel, and everyone noticed the same thing. Elias didn't blink. He sat in the third pew beside his mother, hands folded perfectly, his posture rigid as though he'd been carved there. While other children whispered, kicked their legs, and passed notes, Elias didn't move. His pale blue eyes followed the preacher's every word, not with faith, but with study, like a scientist observing a strange ritual. The preacher spoke about forgiveness and the mercy of God, and that was when Elias leaned toward his mother and whispered, "What if God doesn't forgive?" Margaret Monroe stiffened. She told him to hush, but his question stayed with her all day. When she looked into his eyes later that evening, she saw something that frightened her. Not rebellion, not anger, but absence. It was as if her son didn't understand what guilt or forgiveness even meant. That same night, while the town slept, Elias went to the barn behind their house. The wind rattled through the rafters, and moonlight cut across the wooden floor. He brought with him a small bird he had caught near the creek, a robin with one broken wing. He placed it gently on a wooden crate, then simply watched it breathe. He didn't hurt it, not yet. He just stared, fascinated by the fragile rhythm of its chest. For hours, he observed how fear made it tremble, how pain made its breathing change. When morning came, the bird was dead. Margaret found it buried beneath a thin layer of straw. She thought a cat had gotten in. Elias didn't correct her. Instead, he asked if they could get a cat of their own. At school, Elias's strangeness deepened. The teacher, Mrs. Wheeler, described him as too quiet to trust. He answered every question perfectly, but never smiled. One afternoon, she caught him staring out the window during arithmetic, his expression blank. When she asked what he was thinking, he replied, "I was wondering how many breaths people have before they stop." She didn't report it. Teachers were used to odd children in small towns, and in 1950s America, nobody thought to send a boy like Elias to a doctor. They called it imagination, not pathology. But imagination doesn't explain what happened next. It began with the Monroe family's animals. One morning, Margaret found the family's old hound lying near the well, its body still and clean. No wounds, no blood. Just gone. The vet said heart failure. Margaret believed him. She needed to. But a week later, 2 chickens were found dead, their heads arranged neatly beside their bodies as if someone had staged them. That's when she confronted Elias. She stood in the doorway of his room, holding the small bodies in her hands. "Did you do this?" she demanded. Elias didn't look up from his notebook. "They were already going to die," he said calmly. "I just wanted to see what would happen first." Margaret slapped him. It was the only time she ever did. For a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not pain, not remorse, but curiosity. Then, he simply said, "Does that make you feel better?" Mother, from that day forward, something changed in the house. Margaret began locking her door at night. She prayed harder, attended every church meeting, begged the preacher for guidance. The preacher told her that children sometimes stray, that discipline and prayer could fix anything. But prayer doesn't mend what isn't broken in body, only in spirit. By the time Elias was 10 years old, he had mastered the art of mimicry. He learned how to smile when others did, how to laugh when expected. He practiced empathy the way others practiced handwriting, copying what he saw without ever feeling it. He could charm his teachers now, hold doors for old ladies, and make his mother's friends say things like, "Such a sweet boy." Yet in private, his notebooks grew darker. He started sketching faces, not of people he knew, but people in pain. He wrote words beneath them, still, quiet, gun. One page simply read, "Control is everything." It was the sheriff, a man named Henry Dawes, who first began to suspect something strange about Elias. He'd known the boy's father, Harold Monroe and pitied the widow and her son. But when reports of missing farm animals spread, pigs, chickens, even a calf, Dawes noticed a pattern. All within a mile of the Monroe property. One evening he stopped by for a friendly visit. Elias opened the door before Dawes could even knock, as if he'd been waiting. "Mother's resting," he said, his voice flat. The sheriff nodded and stepped inside. The barn door, as always, was shut tight. Dawes tried to peer through a crack, but Elias stood directly in front of it. "You don't want to go in there," the boy said softly. "It smells bad." That should have been a warning, but Dawes, like everyone else, underestimated him. To the sheriff, Elias was still just a boy. A strange one. Yes, but too small to be dangerous. A week later, the sheriff's dog vanished. In Brook Hollow, people whispered about coyotes or wildcats or the wrath of God. Margaret stopped attending church altogether. She looked pale, brittle, and nervous whenever she appeared in town. "He's different," she once told the store clerk quietly. "I can't reach him anymore." The clerk assumed she meant teenage mood swings. But Elias wasn't even a teenager yet. He was 11. One afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled across the plains. Wind howled through the barn, lightning flashing against the fields. Margaret called for her son, but he didn't answer. She found him hours later, soaked and barefoot, standing over the open well. When she asked what he was doing, he said, "Listening to how deep it goes." She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Margaret packed a suitcase and went into town. She told the pastor she feared her son might be possessed. The pastor promised to visit the next day, but when he did, Margaret was gone. Her bed was untouched, her shoes still by the door. Elias said she'd gone to visit her sister in Aberdeen. The sheriff confirmed that there was no sister. Brook Hollow had seen many tragedies, but none so silent, none so chilling. The boy remained alone on the property, tending to the fields, answering questions calmly. When asked where his mother went, he always said the same thing. She wanted peace. For 3 long days after Margaret Monroe's disappearance, Brook Hollow whispered but did nothing. The town was small, the kind of place where people talked more than they acted, where silence was mistaken for decency and denial passed for kindness. Nobody wanted to believe that something terrible had happened to the widow. Margaret had been well liked, a quiet woman who kept to herself after her husband's death in the coal mill accident. But her son Elias was a different story. People had always said he was strange, though they never agreed on what kind of strange. Some called him a genius. Others called him hollow. Now, with his mother missing, they started calling him cursed. On the morning of July 18, 1955, Sheriff Henry Dawes finally decided to visit the Monroe farm again. He drove the dirt road slowly, dust rising behind his truck, his gut heavy with dread. The cornfields swayed lifelessly under a dull gray sky, and the barn loomed like a secret keeping itself. Elias was outside, sitting on the porch steps, barefoot as always, with a book open in his lap. When Dawes greeted him, the boy looked up and smiled faintly. "Morning, Sheriff. You came about my mother?" Dawes nodded. "Son, folks are worried. No one's heard from her in days. She's resting," Elias said. "She's tired." The sheriff frowned. "Tired where, exactly?" Elias tilted his head slightly. "You ask questions like you already know the answers, Sheriff." The man's spine went cold. "I don't play games with missing persons, boy. Where is she?" For a long moment, Elias didn't answer. Then he pointed toward the barn. "Maybe she's where the quiet things go." Dawes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. He reached for the latch, but the barn door wouldn't budge. Elias was watching him, that same unreadable calm on his face. "Keys," Dawes demanded. "I don't use locks," the boy replied. "If something wants out, it should be allowed." The sheriff stepped back and shouldered the door open. The smell hit him first. Damp hay, old metal, and something beneath it all, decay. A single shaft of light cut through the darkness, illuminating hanging tools, empty feed sacks, and a pile of dirt near the far wall. "What's that?" Dawes asked. Elias didn't answer. The sheriff knelt beside the mound. The earth was freshly turned. His hands trembled as he brushed the top layer aside, revealing a piece of fabric, faded blue cotton, like the kind Margaret used to wear. He froze. "Jesus Christ." Elias spoke quietly behind him. She said she wanted peace. Dawes turned, his face white. "What did you do?" The boy just looked at him. No guilt, no panic. Only curiosity. She kept asking me to stop hearing the voices in the house. But there aren't any voices, Sheriff. Just the quiet. She didn't like the quiet. The sheriff stood abruptly, stumbling back. You killed her. Elias smiled faintly. No, she's still here. Something in his tone, calm, confident, made Dawes' skin crawl. He drew his pistol, the old Colt he rarely unholstered. Stay right there. But Elias didn't move. If you shoot me, who'll tell you where the rest are? That was the first time Dawes realized there might be more. The sheriff called for help, his voice breaking over the radio as he demanded backup. But Brook Hollow didn't have much of a force. Just one deputy, who wouldn't arrive for nearly an hour. In that time, Dawes stayed by the barn door, watching the boy like he might vanish if he blinked. Elias hummed to himself softly. A tune with no rhythm, no melody, just a pattern of sound that felt wrong. When Dawes told him to stop, Elias said, "That's what she said too." When Deputy Cole finally arrived, the two men dug through the mound. What they found wasn't just one grave. Beneath the layer of soil were 3 smaller pits, each one containing animal remains, but not just livestock. There were skulls, small and human-shaped, though too old to be recent. Dawes realized they weren't Margaret's, but perhaps older victims. Bones from long before the Munros ever owned the property. "What in God's name?" Cole whispered. Elias spoke softly behind them. "They've always been here. I just found them." The sheriff turned, furious and terrified. "You're lying." The boy tilted his head. "If I were lying, you'd feel better, wouldn't you?" Was then Dawes saw the drawings nailed to the barn wall. Crude sketches done in pencil, each one depicting faces twisted in pain. Their eyes blackened out. One of them was Margaret. Beneath her picture, in a child's handwriting, was a single word, peace. Dawes arrested Elias that afternoon. The whole town gathered to watch as the boy was led away in handcuffs, his pale hair hanging in his eyes. He didn't fight, didn't cry. He simply looked around at the crowd and said, "You'll all forget her soon." But Brook Hollow didn't forget. They talked for decades about that barn, that smell, those bones. The farm was abandoned, left to rot under weeds in silence. Some said they saw lights flicker inside it at night. Others claimed to hear humming in the fields. Elias Monroe was placed in the South Dakota Juvenile Asylum for severe emotional detachment. The doctors wrote long reports about his intelligence, how he could memorize entire books, how he asked questions about death that no adult could answer comfortably. One doctor called him a genius without conscience. Another simply wrote, "This boy feels nothing." That is his power. The years later, when a reporter from the Soaks Herald visited the asylum, she asked him why he did it, why he buried his mother, why he drew her dead. Elias only smiled and said, "I didn't draw her dead. I drew her quiet." No one knew exactly what he meant, but after that interview, the reporter never went back. And 3 weeks later, Elias Monroe vanished from the asylum without a trace. The guards swore no one escaped. His cell was locked from the inside. All that remained was his notebook, open on the bed, the last page read, "She's still here. The quiet never ends." The morning Elias Monroe disappeared, the asylum smelled of rain and bleach. Storms had rolled across the prairie all night, hammering the old brick building with wind and thunder until even the nurses whispered prayers under their breath. The patients hadn't slept. The halls flickered with unstable lights, and the air hummed with that uneasy stillness that always comes before something terrible happens. By dawn, when orderly Samuel Griggs began his round, cell 27 was already open. The key still hung on its hook in the guardroom. There were no broken locks, no shattered windows, no footprints in the hall. Elias Monroe, 12 years old, pale as candle wax, smaller than his jumpsuit, was simply gone. His bed was made perfectly. His books were stacked by size and color. The only sign that anyone had ever lived, there was a single piece of paper left on the pillow. Written in perfect handwriting were 4 words. "She's waiting in silence." The asylum erupted into panic. The staff searched every inch of the facility. The basement, the boiler room, even the laundry tunnels where the wind howled like trapped ghosts. But there was no trace. The only oddity came from the security guard, who claimed to have seen a light flickering in the garden sometime around 3 a.m. He thought it was lightning. Later, he swore it looked more like a lantern, carried by a child. Within hours, the news spread across South Dakota. Boy murder escapes asylum. The papers called him the Hollow Child. Reporters swarmed Brook Hollow again, cameras flashing against the rotting facade of the Monroe farm. Locals came forward with stories about seeing movement in the old barn, hearing footsteps in the cornfield at night, catching glimpses of a thin figure near the well. Sheriff Dawes, now gray and tired, tried to calm the hysteria. He told the press it was impossible for a child to survive long in those badlands. But privately, he wasn't sure. Because 2 nights after Elias's disappearance, the humming returned. It came from the Monroe property. Low at first, like a song hummed through water, then growing louder as if the wind itself was carrying his tune. Dawes drove there alone, clutching the same revolver he'd aimed at Elias years ago. When he arrived, the barn was open. Rain had soaked the earth, turning the ground to black mud. Inside, the drawings were still pinned to the walls. Only now there were more of them. Faces, dozens. Some looked eerily familiar. Dawes held up his lantern and froze when he saw his own likeness among them. Drawn with shaking pencil lines, eyes hollow, mouth sewn shut. He staggered back, heart pounding, whispering a prayer. That's when he heard the voice. "Hello, Sheriff." It was soft, almost polite. Dawes spun around, light trembling in his hand. The doorway was empty, just rain and wind and darkness beyond. But the voice came again, closer this time. "You said she was gone. But you were wrong, Elias." A pause. Then, quietly, "She doesn't like when you say her name." The lantern flickered out. In the darkness, Dawes fumbled for his gun. He called out again, but the only response was the sound of footsteps. Small, slow, deliberate, circling him in the pitch black. When his backup arrived 2 hours later, they found the sheriff's truck outside, engine still running. Dawes was nowhere to be found. The only thing left behind was his hat, lying in the mud beside the open barn door. After that night, the asylum placed new locks on every door. The state police scoured the nearby towns, farms, and train stations, but Elias Monroe was never seen again, or, perhaps, never clearly, because strange things began happening across the region. In Mitchell, a farmer swore he saw a boy sitting on his fence post just before sunrise, white shirt, bare feet, humming a slow tune. When the farmer approached, the boy was gone. Only the sound of dripping water remained. In Rapid City, a young nurse at the county hospital reported a patient drawing the same phrase Elias had written in his cell. "She's waiting in silence." When she asked what it meant, the patient replied, "The boy told me." And in Brook Hollow, the Monroe property seemed to breathe again. Locals said the grass near the barn never grew straight, the well stayed cold even in summer, and if you stood there at midnight, you could hear 2 voices, one low, one childish, humming together in the dark. 20 years passed. The town moved on, as towns do. The old sheriff's office was turned into a diner. The Monroe farm collapsed into ruin. But the legend didn't die. It became a ghost story told to scare kids, the tale of the boy who vanished into silence. Then, in 1975, construction crews arrived to clear the land for a new highway. When they began digging near the old barn, the foreman called the sheriff's department immediately. They had uncovered bones. Not one body, but 2. One was small, unmistakably a child's skeleton. The other, larger, still wore the remnants of a deputy's badge. DNA testing was decades away, but everyone in Brook Hollow knew the truth. Sheriff Dawes had been found, and beside him, the boy who disappeared, or what was left of him. The coroner reported something odd. The child's bones showed signs of being moved multiple times over the years, as if buried and reburied. And the strangest part, both skeletons were face down, their arms folded neatly beneath them, like they had been placed that way with care. The discovery reignited the legend. People wondered if Elias had ever truly left the farm, or if he had returned there, drawn back to the place where his mother found peace. Some said the sheriff went looking for answers and found what he deserved. Others said neither of them had died there, that their bodies were just shells, and their spirits still wandered the fields. The official report concluded nothing. The deaths were marked as unexplained. The case file was closed, but that didn't stop the stories. In 1992, a tourist passing through Brook Hollow took a photograph of the barn's remains at dusk. When the image was developed, a faint shape appeared in the doorway, the outline of a boy's face, eyes pale, mouth curved in the faintest of smiles. Experts dismissed it as light distortion. Locals didn't. They said Elias Monroe had finally been found, not in body but in the space between sound and silence. And sometimes, When storms roll across the plains, the wind hums that same tune, slow, cold, and eternal. The quiet never ends. Decades passed, but the name Elias Monroe refused to die. Brook Hollow grew smaller, quieter. The population dwindled, the farmland dried, and the stories that once echoed through its streets faded to whispers told around campfires. Yet every generation found its way back to the tale of the Hollow Child. By the late 1980s, the Monroe farm was nothing but a ruin. The barn had collapsed, leaving only its skeleton of warped beams and rusted hinges. The old well was filled with debris, and the wind whistled through the cracks like a voice that couldn't rest. Teenagers began sneaking there at night, daring each other to spend an hour inside the barn. Most came out laughing, a few didn't. In 1989, 3 high schoolers from nearby Harlan County filmed themselves exploring the property. They carried one of those bulky camcorders, the kind that whirred loudly when recording. The footage, later found abandoned in the sheriff's archives, was grainy but clear enough to tell a story. The boys joked at first, flashing lights across the walls. They found the drawings, those same faded pencil sketches that had somehow survived 30 years of decay. The faces were smeared and warped now, but one still stood out, a child's pale outline, mouth open in a soundless hum. Then one of them asked, "What's that sound?" The tape captured it, faint, rhythmic, almost like humming, rising from the floorboards beneath their feet. The boy holding the camera laughed nervously, said it must be wind. But the other whispered, "It's coming from the well." The camera shook, pointed toward the corner where the old well still sat, covered with wood planks, chains draped across. As they moved closer, the humming stopped. One of the boys, Tyler, lifted the cover. The camera tilted just enough to catch a shape, something pale, small, pressed against the inner wall of the well, like a face looking up. Then the tape cut to static. Tyler was never seen again. The other 2 told police he fell, but when rescue crews drained the well, they found nothing, no body, no sign of anyone ever being there. Just cold, still water that never seemed to warm, no matter the season. After that, the county sealed the property again, but the story spread fast. News channels picked it up briefly under headlines like "Ghost Farm of South Dakota" and "Teen Vanishes in Haunted Well." And just like that, the Hollow Child became more than a local ghost tale. It became a legend of America's dark heart. By the 1990s, it had turned into a campfire favorite. Horror enthusiasts claimed the story represented the psychopathy of innocence, a metaphor for evil born, not made. But locals didn't talk in metaphors. They believed Elias was still there, not as a ghost, but as something older, quieter, patient. Then came the documentary era. In 2006, an independent filmmaker named Laura Grayson came to Brook Hollow to shoot the Hollow Child fact or folklore. She interviewed old residents, sifted through police files, and even visited the asylum that once held Elias. What she found was stranger than any ghost sighting. The asylum's record books listed Elias Monroe's intake and death dates, both blank. His file ended abruptly after the word, "released." But no one at the asylum remembered signing those papers. One nurse, now elderly and living in Rapid City, told Laura he left the night the lights went out, and they never came back on right after that. Laura's final stop was the Monroe farm. She brought a small crew, 2 cameramen and a sound operator. They filmed the ruins by lantern light, capturing the eerie atmosphere that fans of the paranormal adored. Around midnight, her sound recorder picked up something beneath the wind, a low, tonal vibration, like a hum. When she asked her crew if they heard it, they shook their heads. But the hum grew louder in her headphones, pulsing like a heartbeat. She followed the sound toward the old well. Her cameraman protested, saying it wasn't safe, but she ignored him. The footage shows her lowering a microphone into the darkness, her face pale in the light. Then she whispered, "Elias, are you there?" The hum stopped. What came next was silence. A full minute passed before the crew began packing up. But when Laura returned to her hotel room and reviewed the recording, she heard something else. Between the static and wind, a child's voice whispered, "You shouldn't have said her name." The next morning, she was gone. The police found a rental car near the property, doors open, keys still in the ignition. Inside the trunk, her camera, still recording. The footage ended with a single frame of Laura's face in night vision, her eyes wide, her lips parting as if to scream. Then black. Her body was never found. After that, the state declared the Monroe farm off limits. A fence was built, the land deemed unstable. But trespassers still came, drawn by something they couldn't name. A few claimed to hear humming near the fence line. Others saw a figure, a boy with pale hair standing ankle-deep in the fog, just watching. Every decade, new reports surfaced: a child's laughter caught on radio static, an unexplained voice in recordings made near Brook Hollow, sketches appearing on walls of abandoned barns, always the same: hollow eyes, open mouth, the word peace. Even in the age of the internet, Elias Monroe didn't fade. His name became an urban legend thread shared across forums and horror podcasts. Some said he was a ghost trapped between worlds. Others claimed he was a demon born of silence itself. But those who knew the town, the few who still lived there, whispered a different theory. They said the curse of Brook Hollow wasn't about Elias. It was about what his mother whispered before she died. Something no one but him heard. Something that changed him forever. They said he didn't kill her out of hate, but out of love twisted beyond repair. That he believed by silencing her, he could bring her peace. And that every soul he touched since then was another offering to that same quiet. Because Elias Monroe didn't just vanish. He learned to exist where silence begins, and some nights when storms roll over the plains, if you listen carefully to the wind through the broken boards of the Monroe barn, you can still hear him. Not humming, not whispering, but breathing, waiting for someone else to speak her name. By 2015, the story of Elias Monroe had become a staple of online horror culture. You could find him on Reddit threads, YouTube ghost documentaries, and TikTok real hauntings compilations. But to Dr. Evelyn Grant, a criminal psychologist from the University of Chicago, he wasn't a ghost story. He was an unsolved psychological phenomenon. Grant had spent 2 decades studying juvenile psychopathy, real cases of children who killed without remorse. When she first heard the legend of the hollow child, she dismissed it as folklore. But one night, while scrolling through old microfilm records from the South Dakota State Asylum, she came across something she couldn't explain. The asylum's 1953 register listed Elias M. among its patients. The handwriting was faint, but under the discharge date column instead of a date, there was a single word: returned. Returned to where? No one knew. That mystery pulled her into the heart of Brook Hollow, a place that locals avoided like a wound that refused to close. She arrived in late October, the sky bruised with storm clouds, the wind carrying the scent of old dust and cold iron. The Monroe property was still fenced off, its warning signs weathered and torn. But Evelyn wasn't a tourist. She had permission. She carried with her a box of files, an old tape recorder, and a quiet determination to end the myth that had haunted the region for almost a century. Every legend, she told her assistant, starts with a truth. I'm here to find it. The farmhouse was gone, but the barn still stood, half collapsed, its roof bowed like a dying animal. The well was sealed under a metal plate, chained and padlocked by the state. Yet as she approached, Evelyn felt an odd pressure in her chest. Not fear exactly, but something heavier. Like the air was waiting for her. She set up her recording equipment near the barn door. Her voice, calm and professional, filled the static. October 28, 2015, location Brook Hollow, South Dakota. Objective: document environmental sounds and potential origins of the hollow child legend. For an hour, she recorded nothing but wind and the creaking of the old wood. Then, just as she began to pack up, her headphones buzzed with low feedback, a vibration deep and pulsing. It almost sounded like humming. Evelyn froze. She rewound the tape, listened again. There it was, faint, rhythmic, familiar. She adjusted her microphone toward the well. The sound grew sharper, clearer, like a child's lullaby playing from somewhere underground. She whispered, "Elias, is that you?" The humming stopped. Then, from the recorder's speaker, came a voice, soft, emotionless, and close. "You found me." Evelyn's pulse spiked. She stepped back, heart pounding, but kept the recorder steady. "Who am I speaking to?" she asked. A pause. Then the voice again, childlike, almost polite. "You said her name." Evelyn didn't understand. Whose name? No answer. Only the wind rising, whistling through the barn boards. She ended the session and returned to her motel in town, shaken but intrigued. Reviewing the audio later that night, she noticed something else. Underneath the voice, faintly, was a woman's whisper, slower, almost chanting. She played it at half speed, isolating the sound. The words were nearly indecipherable, but one phrase repeated: "Peace, my son, peace." It was the same phrase carved into the walls of the Monroe barn decades earlier. The next morning, Evelyn drove to the county archives. With the help of an elderly clerk, she found a record that had been misplaced for years. A coroner's note from 1948, listing the death of Martha Monroe, age 34. Cause of death, asphyxiation. The document included a chilling remark from the attending physician. The child was present at the time of death. He stated she was quiet now. Evelyn felt the pieces connect in her mind. The mother's whisper. The boy's silence. The well. It wasn't about haunting. It was about inheritance, the passing of trauma like a disease. Elias hadn't been possessed. He had been trying to make the world as quiet as his mother's final breath. That night, Evelyn returned to the barn one last time. Rain fell in sheets, drumming on the tin roof. She brought a recorder, flashlight, and a single candle. If he's still here, she told herself, he deserves to be heard and released. She set the candle by the well and began to speak softly. Elias, I know what happened. You wanted to help her. But it's over now. You can rest. Silence. Then a long sigh echoed through the barn. Not wind, something deeper, older. The candle flickered, nearly died, then steadied again. Evelyn looked around, her breath fogging in the cold air. On the wall behind her, faint outlines appeared. Fingerprints first, then handprints, then the shape of a small child's figure. He was drawn in dust, not shadow, like the air itself remembered him. A whisper came, barely audible. Can you make her stop? Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. She's gone, Elias, she whispered. You can go too. The air stilled. The humming faded. And for the first time in recorded history, the Monroe barn was quiet. The next morning, the sheriff found Evelyn's car parked by the gate. Her equipment was still inside, undisturbed. On the seat, her recorder still running. The final minute of audio captured nothing but wind. Then, at the very end, a single word, thank you. Evelyn never returned to Chicago. Some say she moved away quietly, leaving her career behind. Others claim she still visits the plains every autumn, standing by the old fence line, listening to the silence she helped restore. But those who live in Brook Hollow tell another version. They say the night after Evelyn left, the chains over the well broke on their own. And when dawn came, the barn stood still, no humming, no whispers, only peace. Yet sometimes, when the wind is low and the earth is cold, a faint child's voice drifts through the fields, not in sorrow, but in calm. It says one thing over and over, she's quiet now. And for the first time, Brook Hollow finally believes him. By the time Evelyn Grant's name resurfaced, nearly a decade had passed. Her disappearance was a footnote in forgotten academic journals, lost beneath newer scandals and theories. But for Noah Mercer, a 32-year-old journalist from Minneapolis, her case wasn't just a mystery. It was the story that could save his dying career. Noah had once been a respected investigative writer, known for chasing ghost stories with logic, stripping myth down to human truth. But a failed expose and a brutal lawsuit left his reputation in ruins. So when he stumbled across a Reddit post mentioning the hollow child and a psychologist who vanished after visiting the Monroe barn, his instincts lit up. He knew there was something there, something both real and cursed. He started digging. The first thing he found was the audio recording. It wasn't easy, buried deep in an archived server belonging to the University of Chicago's psychology department. Labeled simply as BG Twothine Field Session 3, WAV, it was Evelyn's final tape recovered by police but never made public. Noah downloaded it that night. The recording began with the same clinical tone she'd been known for. October 29, 2015. Subject Elias Monroe. Purpose attempted communication. Then static. Then humming. And then that voice. The same childlike whisper that had become urban legend among paranormal forums. You found me. Noah felt his spine tighten. It was one thing to read about it, but another to hear it. The soft tremor, the detached politeness, the emptiness beneath every word. He listened through the night, replaying it until dawn. At first, he thought he was imagining things, background noises, distortions. But there were words in the static, whispered syllables that didn't belong to Evelyn or the boy. A woman's breath saying, "Peace, my son. Peace." Noah leaned closer, lowering the speed until the voice became clear. The last line before the tape ended wasn't Evelyn's. It wasn't the boy's. It was something else. He isn't done. That phrase looped in his head for days. By mid-November, Noah packed his camera, drone, and recorder and drove the 12 hours south to Brook Hollow, South Dakota. The town was little more than a ghost. 2 gas stations, 1 diner, and a population too old or too wary to care about the past. Yet the moment he mentioned the Monroe property, conversations died mid-sentence. At the diner, a waitress named Leela, with tired eyes and nicotine fingers, leaned close and said quietly, "People don't talk about that boy. Not since that doctor woman came snooping. Some say she freed him. Others say she replaced him." "Replaced him?" Noah asked. Leela just shrugged. Whatever she let out, it never left. That night, Noah camped near the barn. The structure stood crooked against the horizon, its boards silvered with age. Its roof caved like a broken spine, but the air was too still. Not even the insects made a sound. He set up his recorder again, whispering into the mic. October 31st, 2024, attempting to retrace Dr. Evelyn Grant's final investigation. For hours, nothing happened. Then, at exactly 12 a.m., his camera light flickered. Through the static lens, a shape appeared in the doorway. The faint outline of a woman, her silhouette bent as if listening. She wasn't moving, just standing there. No called out softly, "Dr. Grant." No response. He took 1 step closer. The camera auto-focused, and the figure dissolved, leaving behind a faint sound, like soft weeping. He looked down at his recorder, and his blood ran cold. The tape was moving, but the battery light was off. It wasn't even on. And then, that voice. "You said her name." Noah's breath caught. The exact same words Evelyn heard before she vanished. He stumbled backward, whispering, "Elias!" Silence. Then, faintly, through the wind, came the voice of a woman, gentle, trembling, motherly. "Don't wake him." A sudden gust tore through the barn, slamming the door shut. His light went black. In that darkness, Noah could swear he heard footsteps, small ones, pacing in circles around him. His heart thundered. Then a whisper brushed his ear. "She's quiet now." He bolted outside, falling into the wet grass, gasping under the night sky. When he looked back, the barn was glowing faintly from within, not with fire, but with a cold, bluish light pulsing like a heartbeat. By morning, everything was still. The barn dark again. His camera was cracked, the lens shattered from the fall. But the recorder, somehow, had kept running all night. When Noah replayed the tape, he found something impossible. For the first 30 minutes, only wind. Then faint voices. One was Evelyn, no doubt. The other was a child. Their conversation was fragmented, overlapping with static, but one line from Evelyn chilled him most. "If I stay, will it stop?" And the boy's answer, "It never stops. It just learns new names." Noah didn't publish the story immediately. He spent weeks trying to verify the recordings, to match the voice with known samples of Evelyn's speech. But the timestamps didn't match. The voice file wasn't from 2015, it was dated October 31, 2024, the same night Noah was in the barn. His article eventually went live on December 10th, titled, "The Hollow Child Returns." The Woman Who Tried to End the Curse. It became one of the most read features on the American Chronicle website, until it was taken down without explanation 3 days later. The official reason, copyright violation, but Noah received an anonymous email the same day. It had no message. Just an audio file attached, named Brook Hollow, November. MP pressed play. The sound was faint, heavy wind, creaking wood, then a voice tired and calm Evelyn's. "Peace, my son." A then overlapping her voice, a small boy's laughter. Soft, echoing, fading. And then, Noah's own voice captured perfectly, whispering, "You said her name." The file ended. He stared at his screen in silence, heart hammering. He had never said those words aloud during the investigation. Not once. Some nights, when the wind howls through the plains, truckers say they see a figure walking along the old highway. A woman holding a recorder, followed by a small barefoot boy. Others swear they hear 2 voices in the static when tuning between radio stations, one calm, one childlike, both saying the same thing, "Peace, my son." Peace. And somewhere buried beneath the static, just for a moment, Noah Mercer's voice joins them. Winter in South Dakota is a cruel, endless thing, a white wasteland where time seems to pause. By February 2025, the story of the Hollow Child had all but vanished again. The website that ran Noah Mercer's investigation had scrubbed his article completely. His social accounts were deleted. His editor refused to answer calls. To most people, it was over. Another urban legend swallowed by the fog of the internet. But it wasn't over. 3 weeks later, something strange began happening across rural radio stations in the Midwest. Static would break during late night broadcasts, not for seconds, but for minutes at a time. Then, between the crackle and hiss, a faint child's voice could be heard whispering fragments of sentences. "She's quiet now. You said her name." Never stops. At first, people dismissed it as interference, but when the FCC traced the audio frequencies, they all led to a single source, an abandoned relay tower near Brook Hollow, last active in 1989. That's when Evelyn Grant's recordings resurfaced, or rather mutated. Someone or something was broadcasting them on a loop, each version slightly different. Some contained whispers that weren't in the original files. Others played voices that seemed too new to belong to the past. One particular tape, known among collectors as the final broadcast, sent a chill through everyone who heard it. It began with the sound of wind. Then Noah Mercer's unmistakable voice. "This is not me. I didn't." Static. Then Evelyn's voice, overlapping his. "Peace, my son." And then the child's voice, higher this time, laughing softly. He said her name. The broadcast always ended the same way, with 30 seconds of silence, followed by a heartbeat sound that faded into static. The recording spread fast. It hit Reddit, YouTube, and TikTok. Conspiracy channels called it proof of government experiments. Paranormal groups said it was Elias reclaiming his story. Audio engineers broke down the frequencies and found something unnerving, a repeating waveform, identical to a human heart rhythm. And yet, no one could explain how Noah's voice was there. He had vanished 2 months earlier. Then came the Brook Hollow blackout. On March 2nd, every radio in a 20-mile radius began playing the final broadcast simultaneously, even those without power. Old transistor radios, car stereos, ham radio rigs, all flickered on alive with static. Residents reported hearing voices outside their homes, echoing the same words they heard through the speakers. Sheriff reports later confirmed that the Monroe barn burned that night. No one claimed responsibility. The fire department found no lightning, no accelerants, just ash and a melted tape recorder among the debris. But one detail never made the news. Inside the ash, investigators found a set of footprints leading away from the barn. Small, barefoot, perfectly formed. And they didn't stop. They just faded into the frost. A week later, a radio host in Rapid City received a strange package with no return address. Inside was a single flash drive and a note that said, "Play this once. He wants to be heard." The host, thinking it was a prank, queued the file for his late-night segment. At exactly 2:00 a.m. it aired. Listeners described what they heard as a child's confession wrapped in thunder. The voice, soft, detached, said, "I didn't mean to make her quiet. I just wanted her to stop crying." Then came the sound of footsteps, and a woman's whisper. Evelyn's voice, gentle and sad. "You were only a child." The boy replied, "I still am." The broadcast cut off mid-sentence. The station's entire soundboard blew a fuse. Within days, the flash drive vanished from police custody, and yet the phenomenon spread. Truckers reported hearing lullabies over CB radios. Farmers said their barn speakers turned on by themselves, whispering the same 3 words over and over. "She's quiet now." By April, paranormal researchers and digital archivists were calling it the Monroe frequency. Some believed the broadcasts were artificial, leaked data, AI distortion, or secret psychological warfare experiments. Others insisted it was spiritual, that Elias Monroe, the hollow child, had become something else, something woven into the airwaves. A man named Russell Klein, a retired sound engineer, tried to disprove it. He gathered every version of the audio file and layered them together. When he played them simultaneously, something unexpected happened. The voices aligned. Evelyn, Noah, Elias. Their words formed a single coherent sentence. "Why remember what you forget?" The waveform beneath that line pulsed like a heartbeat. Klein destroyed his hard drive that night. In June 2025, a new YouTube channel appeared, Whispers from Brook Hollow. No intro, no description, just grainy black and white footage of empty barns, abandoned wells, and winter fields. Every few days, a new video uploaded automatically, each one with the same cryptic title format, Session 11, Session 12, Session 13, but when played backwards, the file name spelled a sentence. The silence never ends. Viewers who watched long enough reported seeing a figure appear at the 6:06 timestamp, a boy standing in the background, staring into the camera. His face was blurry, but the outline of his mouth moved in sync with the static. She's quiet now. YouTube banned the account after 72 hours, but copies of the video spread. Through archives, torrent sites, USB drops, and even today, if you tune to 104.6 FM around Brook Hollow between 300 and 3:30 a.m., you might hear a child's hum cutting through the static. Some say it's feedback. Others say it's Elias trapped between stations, between silence and memory. The last known message, captured by a shortwave enthusiast, was simple but devastating. A young boy's voice fading into the storm, whispering, "Tell her I stopped crying." Then the heartbeat. Then nothing. Noah Mercer's name appeared once more in the FCC's broadcast logs. Under Source ID, the system displayed a chilling note, untyped by any human. KRDING. My VBAN. But Noah had been missing for months. The broadcast ended at 3:33 a.m. At 3:34, every radio in Brook Hollow went silent forever. By 2030, Brook Hollow had become a ghost town in more ways than one. What few families remained spoke of the hum, a low, almost inaudible vibration that rolled through the earth late at night. It rattled windows, made dogs whimper, and sent people dreaming of a child whispering through static. The government called it a geological anomaly. Locals called it Elias. 6 years had passed since the final broadcast, yet the story refused to die online. It had mutated from a true crime mystery into an urban horror myth whispered across podcasts and conspiracy boards. And for Harper Lang, a 29-year-old documentary filmmaker obsessed with forgotten American tragedies, it was the one legend she couldn't ignore. Harper had grown up hearing her grandfather talk about the boy in the barn. But unlike most, she didn't dismiss it as superstition. She wanted proof, not just to scare audiences, but to understand how one family's tragedy could ripple through centuries. So in the autumn of 2030, she and a small crew, sound tech Darius Holt and archivist Mina Reyes, drove into South Dakota with a single mission to locate the source of the hum. They arrived in Brook Hollow on October 13th. The town was silent, half abandoned, the streets cracked with weeds. The Monroe property, once fenced off by state order, now stood open, its borders forgotten. The barn was gone, or so everyone said, but Harper noticed something strange. At sunset, as the wind turned colder, she saw the outline of a structure shimmering faintly in the distance, as if made of smoke or heat. The barn's ghost. It was visible only when the light hit the field at a certain angle. Darius, checking his sound meter, frowned. We're getting frequency spikes. Subsonic. Coming from the ground. The Mina adjusted her recorder. The needle danced wildly. It's not wind, it's rhythmic. Harper knelt, pressing her ear to the earth. Beneath the soil she heard it, a pulse. A low human heartbeat. That night they camped near the site. Around 200 a.m., Harper woke to find the radio in her tent flickering on by itself. The dial turned to 104.6 FM. The same cursed frequency from the broadcast years ago. Static. Then a voice. You came back. Harper froze. Who's there? No reply. Just the soft hum, steady and cold. Then the voice again, younger this time. You heard me. The static broke into short bursts of sound, a thud, a creak, a woman's faint whisper. Harper leaned closer to the radio, whispering. Elias? I stopped crying, the child said. The signal cut out. At dawn, Harper led her team to the spot where the sound had been strongest. The ground there was softer, disturbed, like something had been buried and dug up over and over. They began to dig carefully, expecting old wood or a pipe. What they found instead was a metal box, rusted and cracked, but still humming faintly. Inside was a tape recorder, same model Evelyn Grant had used back in 2015. But it was still running. Mina stepped back, trembling. That's not possible. The battery should have died decades ago. Harper, her hands shaking, pressed play away. The tape hissed. Then a woman's voice filled the air. Older, rougher than Evelyn's, but calm. If anyone finds this, please don't try to fix what's already gone quiet. The boy is still here, but not as you think. Then came a deep, dragging breath, and a faint echo of another voice, younger, closer. She said my name again. The recorder stopped. Darius dropped his gear. We need to go. Now. But Harper stood frozen, transfixed. That's her. Evelyn, she survived. No, Mina whispered. Listen again. When Harper replayed the tape, Evelyn's voice wasn't just recorded. It was responding to them. Every question they spoke was met with a faint echo seconds later. Who are you? Harper asked. Harper, the voice said back. Where are you? Below. The ground rumbled. Darius backed away, muttering, "This isn't real. This is feedback." But then the hum rose, loud, deep, vibrating through their bones. The field began to move like something alive. Mina screamed as the earth split open near the old well site. The sound was unbearable. Not a roar, but 1,000 whispers overlapping, all speaking the same line. "Peace, my sumped." And then silence. The hum stopped. The wind stopped. Even the birds froze mid-flight, disappearing into the clouds. When they opened their eyes, the barn was there again, whole, black against the horizon. But not solid, a mirage made of sound. Inside, they could see 2 figures, a woman holding a child by the hand, Evelyn and Elias. Harper lifted her camera, but the lens flickered, distorting. When she looked again, the barn was gone. Only the faint smell of smoke and iron lingered. They left that night, shaken but alive. The recorder still hummed faintly, as if breathing. Harper wrapped it in cloth and locked it in a steel case. 3 weeks later, back in Chicago, Harper played the tape one last time. This time, the recording began differently. There was no wind, no static. Just her own voice whispering, "I found you." She hadn't said that. Then a child's laughter, soft, rhythmic, almost sweet. "You said her name." And faintly, from somewhere in the background, Evelyn's voice again, wary but kind. "Peace, my son. Peace." The tape ended with the sound of the hum returning, rising until it filled the room, vibrating the windows, shaking the glass. Then a knock at her door. When Harper opened it, the hallway was empty, but on the floor sat a small tin box, old, rusted, engraved with a single word, "Returned." Inside was a lock of blonde hair, and a note written in neat handwriting. "The silence remembers you." The hum still echoes in Harper's recordings. Every time she edits footage, she swears she can hear a boy's breath between the frames, waiting, patient, and quiet. And sometimes, in the dead hours before dawn, her speakers flicker on by themselves. A child's voice fills the room. "You said her name." Then the heartbeat. Then nothing. Harper Lang hadn't slept in days. Since returning from South Dakota, the hum followed her everywhere. Through the walls of her apartment, in the wiring of her lights, even in the static before her phone rang. It wasn't loud anymore. It was subtle, pulsing like a hidden heartbeat that only she could hear. The world outside moved on as if nothing had happened. The documentary she'd risked everything to make was sitting unfinished on her hard drive, its last scene corrupted beyond repair. Her crew had scattered, Mina had quit filmmaking altogether, and Darius refused to answer her calls. He'd moved back to Detroit, changed his number, and deleted every file related to the trip. But Harper couldn't let go. She didn't want to. Because deep down, she knew the story wasn't over. Late one night, she sat in her editing room, the monitor glowing pale blue against the dark. The recorder, the one they found in the field, sat on the table in front of her. Still, quiet. Yet she could feel it vibrating softly, in sync with her pulse. She pressed lie. Static filled the room, then silence. She waited. Then a faint voice, not from the past but the present. "Harper?" Her blood ran cold. It was her own voice. Then a child's voice whispered over it, "You came back." The lights flickered. The hum deepened. For a second, she saw the reflection of a small figure behind her on the screen. A boy, barefoot, standing in the corner of the room. When she turned, there was nothing. Only the smell of damp wood and iron. The next morning, Harper drove to the State Archives in Pierre, South Dakota, determined to find what the local records never mentioned, the real story of Elias Monroe and his mother, Evelyn. After hours of searching through microfilm, a single page from the Brook Hollow Ledger dated September 14, 1912. The headline read, "Remains discovered beneath old barn. Mother and child identified." The article said a construction team had unearthed 2 skeletons during a rebuild. A woman and a young boy, their arms intertwined. The bones had been reburied quietly on Monroe family land, unmarked, forgotten. But one sentence at the bottom caught her eye. Locals recall that the ground beneath the barn has never stopped trembling since. Harper's hands shook as she printed the record. This wasn't just myth, it was evidence. She had to go back. On October 31st, Harper returned to Brook Hollow one last time. The fields were dead silent, the sky a dull gray. She carried only her camera, the recorder, and a small wooden cross she'd carved herself, for Evelyn and Elias. The hum greeted her the moment she stepped onto the property. It wasn't hostile now, almost like recognition. She followed it to the center of the field. where the barn had once stood. The grass there was thin and pale, like it hadn't grown right in years. She dug a shallow trench and placed the cross upright. "You deserve peace," she whispered. But the air shifted. A cold wind swept through and the ground began to tremble. From the soil, faint voices rose, dozens of them, layered, overlapping. Men, women, children, all whispering the same thing. He was not alone. Harper's heart pounded. Who wasn't? The recorder clicked by itself. Evelyn's voice answered. He opened the door. Suddenly the world went white, a flash of light, then darkness. When Harper opened her eyes, she wasn't in the field anymore. She was inside the barn, whole again, restored as if time had folded back. The smell of hay and decay filled the air. Moonlight streamed through the cracks in the walls, and standing in the center of the barn was a boy, pale, barefoot, his eyes too dark for his face. "Elias," he smiled faintly. "You heard me." Harper stepped forward, trembling. "You're real." He tilted his head. "I'm what's left." Behind him, the shadows shifted, forming vague shapes of people, whispering without mouths. The enslaved, the forgotten, the broken. All those who had lived and died on that cursed land. "They're not angry," Elias said softly. "They just don't want to be forgotten." Harper knelt. "Then what do you want from me?" "To remember," he said, "and then to stop." He reached out a hand, small, trembling, cold as frost. She hesitated, then took it. The moment their fingers touched, her mind flooded with visions. The plantation burning, the cries of children, Evelyn's final prayer in the dark. Harper saw the night the barn burned, the way Evelyn held her son and whispered, "Peace, my son," as the flames swallowed them both. Then silence. When Harper opened her eyes again, she was alone. The barn was gone. The field was just earth and wind. The hum was gone too. Weeks later, Harper's unfinished documentary appeared online, uploaded automatically from her account. The video began with her voice. This story began as a search for truth. It ended as a conversation with the past. It showed footage from the field, the radio, the tape, but also things no one had ever filmed. The barn, the child, the light. The final frame lingered on a still image of the wooden cross in the dirt. Then a caption appeared. "For Evelyn and Elias Monroe. Peace at last." After that, the video went black. But if you turn the volume up high enough, just before it ends, you can hear it, faint and rhythmic, a heartbeat, and a whisper soft as dust. The silence remembers you.